Hey guys, in this episode of Hacking Hollywood, we're going to discuss the differences between the Hero Session 5 and the GoPro Hero 7 Black. We're also going to take a look at the FS5 and how it compares to these two cameras, and I want to see what a professional setup looks like compared to a GoPro setup, which is what I'm hoping to use for most of the time, versus what I've been using for the last year, which is the Session 5. But there are some specific things that will be game changers between the three. So these are the three cameras, guys. I'm using a 14mm prime lens on my FS5, which gives me a pretty similar focal length compared to the other two cameras here. The Session 5 and the Hero 7 Black are very close in that as well. I believe the Session is a little wider, but there is a little trick that this Hero 7 Black can do to help kind of compensate for that. I have everything set right now to 4K 24 frames a second to try to get the maximum bit rate for each one of these cameras, and I'll talk to you through a few of these settings, starting with the Session 5. So the first thing I'm going to do is label each camera so that when I'm looking at it, I call it the right name and I don't mess myself up later. Session 5. It's the GoPro Hero Black. Let's get the frame rates correct. So right now, one of our frame rates is off. So let me see if I can easily switch. It's making me switch my Wi-Fi when I switch between the cameras. So just be aware if you're shooting with multiple GoPros, you'll have to have either two devices or jump between the different Wi-Fi settings. So I'm back on the Session 5 Wi-Fi and I'm connecting right now. Sweet, I'm gonna stop that recording for a second. And then I'm gonna make sure our frames are 24. Okay, so we're doing 24 frames at 100 megabits per second on the full-size FS5. The GoPro 7 Black is doing, I think, 78 or so bit rate. And I'm not sure what the Session is, but I'll put it up on the screen when I'm comparing all three cameras so we know what the rating is for all three of them. One big thing to note with GoPros is the ISO performance is very poor. So whatever you're working at, try to limit your ISO to 800 or less. If you're not familiar with that term, just do a quick YouTube search for the three things that really affect your camera, which is shutter speed, ISO, and f-stop, which is also called aperture. So those three things make up how it captures the image. And so those are three things you gotta know if you're gonna do any sort of videography work. So this is the audio of the GoPro Session 5. This is the audio of the FS5 with the NTG1 microphone. And this is the GoPro 7 Hero Black. Hero 7 Black? Whatever the order of the words is. So we can see kind of all three cameras there and their performance versus each other. Let me go ahead and start the screen recording here. Here we are in the real world. I'm gonna go through the Session 5 right now and go through all the menus, and then I'm gonna go switch over to the Hero 7 Black and look at the menus there. Stick with me, it's gonna take a little bit of time, but we'll get through it and it'll all be good stuff. So now we've also got my phone added. We are in the Session 5 right now. I'm gonna go ahead and stop recording on that camera just so you can check out the settings. So as I stop that camera, I'm able to go to settings, and we're shooting at 4K 24 frames a second on the field view wide. Now the Session 5 doesn't have a super wide like the GoPro Hero 7 does. My FS5 is a super 35mm sensor, which is a little bit smaller, I believe, than like a Canon 5D Mark III, whatever you're traditionally using as a photographer, just to give you a heads up. So spot meter, which I haven't messed with really, but ProTone is kind of the unlocking features if you're a pro and you know how to set your settings on a camera. That unlocks a lot of things. Here, I'll hide that real quick. You'll see a lot of the settings went away. So if I turn that back on, ProTone will come back on, white balance, color, all those kind of things come back. So right now I am using a light that's tungsten. Actually, it's daylight, but I gelled it, so it's tungsten now, but whatever. So I'm at 3000, and I believe I set all of them across the board at about that. The color profile I leave on flat. I actually do some color correction in post-production to kind of balance out the colors. And instead of doing GoPro Color, which is a kind of quick and easy way of doing colors, I like to actually grade it a little bit and make it look nice. So the shutter angle, you can set this if you want to, but generally I leave this in automatic mode. That way when it experiences different light levels, it can adjust on its own. So ISO limit, that's an important one I was talking about. If you don't want to have rain, if you don't want to have that background noise, you want to lower that to 800 or less than that if you can get away with it, depending on how much light you have. Depending on what conditions you're shooting in, you want to adjust that one. EV comp, this essentially is your shutter speed that's moving, that's changing. It's going to compensate and kind of set the brightness in a certain range depending on what you're shooting. Sharpness is another key one. By default, this one's set to high. It's expecting you to not do any sort of post-production or minimum post-production workflow, but this is actually going to help us better control over the camera and the look of it, because sometimes that sharpening can be too much, or you want to add it in post and get the clean image captured in camera and then add that back later on in post for a cleaner look. Set up auto rotation, so depending on the orientation of the camera, if it's set vertically or horizontally, it'll adjust. The default mode is video, so when I press the 1 button on the top, it's going to record in 4K 30 frames, which is the default that I have set for that camera. And I don't have voice control. I haven't really messed with that. If you like it, you can try it out and see if it works for you. Beeps are on high, and this can also change depending on what setting you're in. If you're at a church or in a quiet room where you don't want to have the noise every time you turn it on and off the GoPro, you can turn that down. I just leave it on high. That noise doesn't bother me right now. I'm not shooting in a specific condition where I need to adjust that. And I'm shooting NTSC instead of PAL because I am in the States. I'm in the United States. So you can do some deleting of files and reformatting the SD card. The name of the camera, I can't seem to change for some reason. I don't know if that's a firmware issue or what. Maybe in yours you can actually change it. There's also this cool locate camera button just in case you lose it and you need to find it. So Bluetooth devices I haven't messed with. I'm sure there's some sort of remote triggering setup here. And you can see my battery indicator and my SD card capacity. So those are the settings that you see in the Session 5. Now let's switch over. I'm going to start recording again on the Session, and I'm going to switch between my cameras. So to do that, I just swipe over on my phone, but I also have to go into Wi-Fi and change that. So I'm going to try to just prompt it and see if it'll let me switch over through the app, but I bet you it kicks me. It's asking me to join that Wi-Fi network. The cool thing about the Hero 7 is that it prompts me within the app, whereas the Session 5, I have to leave the app, go to settings, and then come back. I think the Hero 7 Black actually allows me to skip a step or two to make it a little bit faster. One thing you'll notice is it doesn't allow me to do a preview in 60 frames. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that camera because I don't want to be in 60. So when you switch between most compatible and high efficiency, it essentially resets your settings in the app, just so you know. I've had that happen to me once or twice. So I'm going to go through and fix all the settings that I messed up, and I'm going to do 24 frames a second to give me the highest quality data rate that you can have on the card. So with the GoPro Hero 7 Black, I have to stop recording here and then I'll be able to show you the apps. Okay, so now let's go into settings and let's look at, we're at 16:9. Some of these settings were different. I think the aspect ratio wasn't a part of the Session. That was only 16:9, which is what I'm going to shoot in anyways. Frame rates, of course, you get to add 60 frames per second on the GoPro 7 Black, whereas the Session 5 is limited to 30 frames a second in 4K. And the field of view, here's the cool thing. Let's see how this jumps out. So as you can see, we're in the super view now, the super wide look. It's a lot more fisheyed. You can see the distortion on the monitor here, but this is what the fisheye looks like, which is kind of interesting, and it could be useful in a situation where you need to be extremely wide. But other than that, I probably won't use that as often. So I'm going to stop recording there. That way I can go back into settings and change this super view back to wide. So that's another interesting thing is the 7 doesn't have 3000K, it has 3200 in the selection. So you can't technically match the same white balance setting between the Session 5 and the GoPro 7 Black. I don't know if that's going to be a huge difference as far as look goes, but we'll see in a couple minutes. Sharpness we set to low as well. Same thing, we can boost it in post if needed. And the color profiles, same thing, GoPro color or flat. I go with flat. Now this raw audio track's kind of interesting. It gives you 4 options: off, low, medium, and high. So you can kind of see the difference. Okay, so we have our 3 clips here. The first one's low, the second one's medium, and the third one is of course high. You can see that the peak amplitude is really low. It's like 48 or so for the low, and the medium it's only 44. So there's not much difference between low and medium. And then the high over here is at about -5. Let's zoom in here and just sync the sound real quick. One thing worth noting is the heads and tails, or the front end and the back end of each of these audio recordings, kind of starts late and ends early. Obviously press record once, and so this second system recording that it has somehow records a delay and ends that recording a little early for some reason. Maybe they'll change this in the future, or maybe that's just part of it when you have 2 systems being recorded at once. So once we have it all synced up, let's listen to the audio at each level: low, medium, and high. Okay, testing. This is with the raw audio set to low. This is how they're low. Okay, testing. This is what the medium setting sounds like. This is what the medium setting raw. Okay, testing. This is what the high audio sounds like, the raw audio, the high. So right off the bat, I've noticed the high sounds completely different than the lows and mediums. I don't know if it's just a lot of boost. I wasn't talking super loudly, but there is a noticeable difference for high for some reason. And if it wasn't for boosting the gain afterwards, I definitely would not have been able to hear low or medium, so it's hard to distinguish those without gain. There's also 4 tracks here, so I'm guessing there's 3 microphones. That's why we have waveforms on 3, and for some reason it wouldn't allow just 3 tracks. It needed to do 4 or 2 paired tracks or something like that, so that's probably why we don't have waveforms on the last track. But I don't see a huge difference in audio between low and medium, depending on the volume of what I'm recording. So obviously 3 different levels of the same track. You can only do 1 at a time for that. I haven't used it that much, but I bet you I'll keep it off. Voice controls I don't tend to use. Beep I have on medium for this one. The other major thing is the video compression, most compatible versus high efficiency. High efficiency uses the new H.265 codec, so it should technically be better, but we're going to do a side-by-side comparison with high efficiency versus most compatible and see which one looks better, if you can see a big difference. If you can't, then high efficiency probably will be the better one to use if you have a new computer, or if you don't, you want to use most compatible. The Session 5 does not have that capability. They only have the most compatible, probably the equivalent there. You can set the time and date. Now this one doesn't give me a camera name to change, to select. So I wonder if there's another way to name your camera. Again, those are the differences between the menus on the Session 5 and the Hero 7 Black. So the first thing right off the bat is we're going to try to compare the stabilization and the framing between these 2 lenses in the real world. I actually have the GoPros on the same rig, so that all my movements, all my gestures and shaking and whatnot affect both cameras. That way you have the exact same motion captured on both cameras and it's affected the same way on both rigs. Right now I'm comparing both of the cameras' 4K capabilities with each other. The Hero 7 Black has the stabilization, the super smooth stabilization for 4K, whereas the Session 5 does not have that stabilization in 4K. It only has it in the 2.7K. So being apples to apples, comparing the 4K resolution, this is what you would get if you're used to shooting in 4K on the Session 5 and you move over to the Hero 7. This is the difference you're going to see. But if you're used to the stabilization, we'll do a quick preview of that as well. Okay, so this is the 2.7K in the Session 5 versus the Hero 7 in the 4K. This is the stabilization test between the 2 cameras. I should have utilized my stabilization more in the 2.7K, but I shoot a lot of other things in 4K and I wanted to master to 4K. So instead of upscaling like I'm doing in this shot here, I just shot at 4K and decided to stabilize in post. So yeah, you can kind of see the difference between the 2 cameras. I'm holding it fairly steady just in my hand with the same rig that's holding both cameras. I would assume or guess that the 7 has some great extra stabilization features that the Session 5 doesn't have even in 2.7K. But I don't know, I'll see you in a couple minutes. So the last check I want to do here is the post stabilization for the Session 5. You can actually see the edges of the frame that it's stabilizing and what it's doing to the image, which is kind of interesting. When your video's full screen, it's going to hide that. So this will just give you an idea of what that's doing and what it looks like. Depending on how you have your settings, I often get these micro jitters, and I know you can adjust them depending on how intense you make the stabilization, but either way, it takes a lot of processing power and it consumes a lot of time in post. And from this test footage, I prefer the Hero 7 Black's internal stabilization much better. And in case you're wondering what the colors look like just straight out of the camera, or the GoPro color instead of a flat color profile, this is what it looks like. So this is straight out of the camera, or if you wanted to do less color correction in post. The main issue I see with this, you have the baked in color profile, so it's going to be a little bit harder to manipulate if you need to change something in post. So I would love to do a montage or a side-by-side comparison between these 2 cameras in a B-roll setting and a real-world setting, but the reality is these cameras ultimately will look very similar when you cut them together, when you do time lapses and all that kind of stuff. There's just a few features that make the GoPro Hero 7 Black worth buying. Number 1 is the stabilization, which is probably you're seeing right now. Number 2 is the audio upgrade, and number 3 is the 60 frames a second in 4K. Those are all big perks. The smaller perks are like the 78 megabits per second instead of 60, so you have more data in the video codec, which is all technical jargon to say that it comes with a higher quality codec or format that the video is captured in, so that's always a plus. The battery that's exchangeable is a big plus for me, because when you run out of power you have to plug it in somewhere. But the one downside, if you have to find one, is that the Session is still smaller, just a little bit smaller. But honestly, at the end of the day, that size is negligible. It's not a huge difference, at least for me. It could be for you, who knows. Maybe if you're wearing this on a head strap all day, it would weigh you down a little bit more. Well, I think that's gonna wrap it up for this video, guys. Thank you for watching the comparison. If I missed any detail that you guys wanted to know about, please leave me a comment. I'll try to answer it. I'm a smaller channel. I'm still in great communication with all of my viewers, so I appreciate it when you guys comment, when you guys subscribe, when you guys are part of my community as well. Thanks everybody, see you on the next one.